All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lizzie Shackelford. I'm a senior fellow here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It is my honor to welcome you to this program today with Senator Tammy Duckworth on Indo-Pacific security. Today's program is on the record, and it is being recorded. As a reminder, views of speakers that we host here at the Council are their own. They do not represent institutional views of the Council. Thanks to our audience that's joining on live streaming as well. You'll have an opportunity to participate also in the Q&A, which we'll do for about the last 20 minutes of the program. If you are in our live stream audience, you can go to ccga.live in your browser. That's ccga.live, and you can submit your questions there. If you're in this audience, we're going to have a microphone set up, which I'm actually looking. Where is it? Where is it? Oh, it is there. Okay. I can't see anything. It's like very bright up here. And you'll be able to go to the microphone to ask questions. If you're in the audience here and you'd rather ask your questions anonymously or just not get up, you can also use ccga.live on your phone. So I'd also like to thank the Senate staff here in Chicago and in Washington for making this program possible. And with that, I would like to introduce the senator. Senator Tammy Duckworth is an Iraq War veteran, a Purple Heart recipient, and a former Assistant Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Senator Duckworth served in the Reserve Forces for 23 years, retiring in 2014 at the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. In 2016, she was elected to the U.S. Senate after serving 2 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Illinois' 8th Congressional District. So with that, I would just like to say welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to start with a question just to kind of set up the context. How do our relationships with countries in the Indo-Pacific benefit your constituents here in Illinois and American families and communities across the country?
Well, at the very macro level, there's a national security component to it, right? You have the PRC, which is attempting to dominate the region, to access its natural resources. They're fishing in other people's territorial waters. They want to do in Asia what they've done in parts of Africa, which is to access mineral resources or trap country into debt traps so that they end up owning entire ports in some of these countries. So there's that national security part. But at the very local level, I mean, our trade with China itself is about $15 billion between Illinois and China, and that's about 75,000 jobs. So we need to grow our economic footprint in the Indo-Pacific even more so. And we're one of actually the largest, in terms of volume of trade in the Indo-Pacific region. Illinois is probably one of the top 3 states in the nation in terms of the amount of trade we have. And people don't even realize it. And a big chunk of that is because what do we produce in Illinois? In ag, we produce corn, soybean, and pork. Those are the top 3, exports that go into that Indo-Pacific region. But then also we do a lot of manufacturing. For a long time, when I was out in the suburbs as a congressman, my congressional district had one of the largest concentrations of tool and die manufacturers in the nation. And they export, and these are all small companies. So there's a lot of jobs involved, there's a lot of national security involved, and locally there's a lot of potential for economic growth and well-being.
And you recently traveled to Japan and Indonesia.
Yes.
Last year you were in Taiwan, so you're spending a fair amount of time, and Korea, so you're spending a lot of time getting around that region. From here, it feels like tensions are on the rise in that region, and in a lot of ways it's linked to our tensions increasing with China. What do you see as our biggest security challenges in the region, and how can we best defend those without provoking conflict or having a negative impact on our economic relationships?
So obviously it's the military to military competition. Our DoD has correctly identified the PRC as our largest, greatest near-peer threat. They are an ascending power. They actually have more of certain types of military platforms and equipment than we do in certain areas, and they are only investing more and more in growing their military presence in the region. So that is where the tension is arising. What we need to do is maintain our presence in the region and in fact grow that presence, because we need to assure things like freedom of navigation in terms of sea lanes and the like. The PRC would like to own and dominate those, but we need to make sure that those sea lanes remain open, not just for us, but for the rule of international law. And it is something that is welcomed by the powers in the region. In fact, I was in Indonesia to visit with ASEAN, the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, our mission there. And one of the things I heard over and over and over again from the ambassadors from the countries in the region was like, we like having the U.S. here in terms of your military in order to maintain the rule of law, the international norms, which the PRC does not adhere to. And in fact, this encroachment on other people's territorial waters is something that they're deeply concerned with. I think our economic presence in the region will help alleviate some of those tensions. People want us there as another option. They want the U.S. to be there economically, but it also means that we're going to engage and trade with the PRC. We're a great state to talk about that, is that we have to maintain trade, and we have to make sure that we set the standards and what those rules are, intellectual property rights, all of those types of things. When I represented all those tool and die manufacturers, their specialty, many of them, was aerospace, and they would say, we would get an order from a Chinese aviation company that says, okay, we want you to sell us a certain number of units on spec, and in 6 months we're going to come back after we test your units, and then we'll order from you. Well, they never got the order, and suddenly they would sign their products being manufactured in the PRC as a competitor to theirs. And so we have to maintain that rule of the laws, and then say, hey, they're intellectual property rights and all of that. So engagement is critical, especially when it comes to economic engagement. And militarily, right now, one of the things that keeps me up at night is that the PRC military does not answer the phone when we call. So that when we had that whole balloon fiasco was happening, our four-star generals could not pick up the phone and talk to their four-star generals. They didn't answer. Unlike when the Russian jet was knocking down our drone, our General Milley could pick up the phone and call his Russian counterpart and de-escalate the situation. That is not happening with the PRC today.
Well, you have just launched a whole series of questions that I haven't followed up to this. So I'm going to start with talking about our expanding military presence, which we have been. We've got news in recent weeks coming out of the Philippines with kind of increasing our presence there. One country's deterrence is another country's provocation, right? So of course, China's position on this is that they're feeling under threat because of our expanding military presence. Our position is we need more of a military, and many of our allies, is that we need more of a military presence to push back on China's aggression in the region, particularly with regard to sea lanes. How do we strike a balance with that in order to have that support for our allies and protecting international law, while also not further provoking China? And are there diplomatic tools, getting to the last point that you were making, that can help us do that in a way that is less confrontational?
Yes. So one of the things we need to do is not force countries to choose. That's how you escalate the tension. And that is to say, Cambodia, Vietnam, you have to choose. It's either the PRC or us. And one of the things that we've decided to do is, as a nation, is that we're not asking people to choose. We're simply growing our presence in the region, offering partnerships with us, for those who want to be allies, for those who want to be friends, for those who just want to be friendly but not a friend. We let them choose and to do that, and which means that we can be engaging in Operation Garuda Shield in Indonesia, joint military training exercises with countries that are also doing similar military training exercises with the PRC military. So I think that helps to sort of de-escalate, but we have to be a presence in the region. As far as diplomatic tools are concerned, I think this is where it's about us reaching out to diplomatically to the PRC one-on-one, but it's also about learning to use friends and allies in the region. So a country like Singapore is a great example where we work with the Singaporeans. They're not an ally, they are a friend. And they also talk with the PRC, and they have better relationships with the PRC than we do, and really use those relationships to normalize how we interact with one another.
And you mentioned the balloon incident, Balloon Gate. And speaking of kind of diplomatic channels, do you see or are you getting any wind of kind of renewing the plans for a trip by Secretary Blinken or something else to try and kind of get past that balloon?
Yes, so I hope that he does renew it. In fact, I hosted a meeting with him and key senators before he was supposed to go. He came and he briefed us in the secure briefing room. We had a great briefing, and he was getting ready to go in, I think, 48 hours, and then the whole thing stopped. And he was just testifying on the State Department budget just 2 days ago. And I urge him to go back. I want him to go and complete this mission to the PRC, and I hope it does. It does happen. There are folks, some folks, some of my colleagues, mostly on the House side, who are saying he should never go, and I don't think that's the right attitude. And in the meantime, we also have the Shangri-La dialogues that are coming up in Singapore in June, where everybody will be there, and that'll be another opportunity to interact. And I think Secretary Austin will be going to that.
Okay. And you mentioned the need for us to maintain economic ties and probably enhance economic ties with China and also across the region. There are a lot of people on the Hill and other parts of Washington who are pushing for further decoupling. We have seen a need for things like being more cautious about national security products that we rely on China for. But where do you see the balance in our economic engagement with China? And how would it impact your constituents here, businesses across the Midwest, for us to have further decoupling with China? For example, talking about the move towards more industrial policy that the Biden administration has been doing.
Yeah, I think that what we need to do, and we learned this from the pandemic, is we need to build a more resilient supply chain, which means that we have to build other manufacturing ecosystems outside of that which exists in the PRC, so that we're not overly reliant. And I think that means that we're growing alternatives, but it's not necessarily decoupling from the PRC, because what's going to happen is there are only going to be some things that we can only manufacture overseas and we can't manufacture here. It just doesn't make sense. It's not cost effective, and you wouldn't want to do it. But we don't want to have all of our manufacturing occurring in the PRC. I'll give you a good example. The little red wagon, that all American kids grow up with, that's an Illinois product. That's a Chicago product. And I spoke with...
That's still a Chicago product?
It's a Chicago company.
Okay.
It's manufactured in the PRC, and by a South Korean company. And speaking with the CEO, who's a grandson of the founder, it was really very interesting, because he said, we were really excited because our manufacturer, the South Korean company, wanted to go and do and manufacture outside of the PRC, and so they were looking at Vietnam and some other places, and they were super excited about that. And they tried it, but it turned out that there's not a suitable ecosystem there. And by ecosystem, I mean, yes, they could manufacture the wagon, but they still had to ship in the boxes for packaging material from the PRC, the styrofoam products from the PRC, the paper from the PRC. So the ecosystem that exists in places like Shenzhen, China, needs to be duplicated in other parts. And we should be working with companies from around the world, whether it's South Korea or Japan, and those things that are not cost effective to be manufactured in the US, let's manufacture those in a friendly third country, Indonesia, Malaysia, wherever. We'll still do some in the PRC, but we just can't be reliant overly on one nation. And that's what we mean by supply chain resiliency.
And some of those issues you were talking about during your recent trip to Japan and Indonesia, right? All right. Were there what countries would you, if you were looking at this scenario and spreading out our supply chains a bit more with friendly countries in that region, where would you be looking to try and move some of that supply chain?
Well, for me, it's definitely Southeast Asia, and it would be throughout Southeast Asia. It just depends on different things. I'll give you an example of something. I am working very hard to position Illinois as the home for the future of green technology manufacturing. People think of the industrial Midwest, they think of that as something that's in the past, and people don't realize that Illinois is a major energy state. And that we are uniquely in a position with our educational resources, our natural resources, and our ag resources to position ourselves to be the producer, provider of technology and fuel to make that transition towards a greener future. So What do I mean? Ethanol that is produced in Illinois from Illinois-grown corn right now, because it is biogenic ethanol, can be produced in a way that's almost net carbon neutral, as opposed to ethanol that's grown and produced in Brazil, where they're cutting down rainforests and planting sugarcane to do it. For us, with the advanced manufacturing practices, we're almost net carbon neutral. We just sunk the first carbon capture sequestration well in Illinois because our geology underneath us is just perfect for that. And within the next 2 years, the ethanol produced in Illinois will be net carbon negative. We should be selling that to the rest of the world. In fact, it's so attractive that LG from Taiwan, they make washing machines, and you probably have an appliance in your home, just signed a deal with ADM in Decatur and opened a factory to take the byproducts of that ethanol production, the fibers, the cellulose fibers. They're now going to be producing bioplastics for things like yoga pants and athleisure wear. That will now make Illinois ethanol net carbon negative. And so for me, it's about who do we work with? Where do we produce some of this? Well, this is a Taiwanese company that's going to work with us. Indonesia has the rare earth minerals for batteries. The only 2 mines in Indonesia that's mining the rare earth minerals and producing the components for batteries are Chinese run, but they use coal power plants to do this. So those batteries are not green certified, and so you can't put them in a Tesla or a Chevy Volt, because if you do, then that car now no longer qualifies for the tax credits for the consumer who buys the car. So I was talking to Panasonic, and they said, well, we are looking to get the rare earth minerals from somewhere else, or find a company that can work with us to mine ethically and meet the green energy requirements to mine in Indonesia, so that we can then produce those batteries here in Illinois to be put in Teslas or Chevy Volts. So I would look everywhere, but I think Southeast Asia is a part of the world that really feels the threat in terms of many of the more malign practices that the PRC engages in, and wants the U.S. there, at the very least, as a presence. They don't want to have to choose, but they would like us to be there almost as a balancing power, and I think we have opportunities.
All right, so just a reminder for our audience here and streaming live, we're going to be shifting to audience questions in just a few minutes. So there's a microphone in the center here, and for those online or who would just like to choose, you can go to ccga.live and submit your questions on there as well. So we'll be turning to that in just a few minutes, and I'll give you a heads up to walk up to the microphone. To shift to another topic that is probably the hottest flashpoint in the region, Taiwan. You've been a consistent advocate of helping Taiwan to build up their defenses against a potential invasion from China. How far do you think the United States should go in its commitment to defend Taiwan, and why is that in the interest of the American people?
It's in the interest of the American people because, in much of the same way as Ukraine is, because it is the first step in more territory being seized by the PRC. And they've already shown this, that they are looking to go beyond just Taiwan. I mean, they've built an entire reef/island. Now they're claiming all the territorial waters around this artificially created landmass. And they are claiming territory in the Spratly Islands. They're claiming territory in Japan and the like. So for me, it's about, again, maintaining those the rules, and international order. You have the people of Taiwan who, say they're democratic. They want to elect their own government. They don't want to be part of the PRC, and so you have to support and endorse that idea of sovereignty. And so I think it is important for us, as long as we're going to, as long as the Taiwanese people want to stand up and defend themselves and declare that they are an independent, democratically elected government, then we should support them. We are the foremost democracy in the world.
And President Biden has recently a few times spoken out fairly directly about what he thinks.
I think his heart gets ahead of the diplomatic norms a lot, yes.
Yes, I'm certain, as someone who's staffed before, I can just imagine in the background. But do you think that now is the time that we should be officially changing our position of strategic ambiguity with regard to Taiwan? Or do you think that the middle ground that we've taken is the appropriate one?
Well, this goes back to your earlier question. Are we going to make the tensions worse? I think abandoning that middle ground will be seen as a threat by the PRC, and it might even provoke them to act and attempt to kinetically occupy Taiwan earlier than they might be planning to do so. So I don't think straying from that ambiguity, that middle ground, is the right decision to be doing right now, because I think that just makes the situation worse. But we can do what we are starting to do now, and I actually passed with Senator with Senator Cornyn of Texas a piece of legislation called the Taiwan Self-Defense Act, which would allow Taiwan to qualify for the ability to be trained by the National Guard in the United States. So our National Guard for each state in this country has a partner with a foreign military where we help train them. So Illinois has been training Poland for over 30 years. And so as I was growing up in the Illinois National Guard, when I was a lieutenant, there was a Polish lieutenant that I got to know, and we sort of grew up together. And that partnership is so ingrained and so deep that oftentimes the military to National Guard connection happens even before mill to mill. And so we're trying to attempt to help the Taiwanese grow their own National Guard, train their own people so that they can do what Ukraine is doing, and that is defend themselves as necessary. And in fact, Ukraine, after Crimea was annexed 8 years ago, immediately pushed to be part of this program. And for the last 8 years, I believe it's been Florida and also Illinois National Guard, because we have so many Polish speakers who can also speak to the Ukrainians. We've been training them for 8 years. So part of why the Ukrainian military is doing as well as it is because they've been trained in a very systematic way for the last 8 years by the National Guard. So that is something we could help the Taiwanese do, which is grow their own self-defense capabilities.
So I'm going to ask one more question before I turn to the audience. But so if there are people in the audience here who'd like to go ahead and line up at the microphone if you have questions for the senator. We won't be taking them from the crowd. We'll be taking them from folks who line up here and from ccga.live as well. So my last question before we turn to the audience, recognizing that this week is the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, and given your distinguished service there. As we look back, there's been a lot of reflection this week. I'm curious from your experience, what you think the lessons are that we either have learned or should have learned from that experience, and what impact do you think that war has had on our reputation in the world?
Yeah, so I think what we've learned and what we should have learned is to not enter into conflicts in an unending way. And that's what we did this past week in Washington, which was vote to repeal the authorization for use of military force for 1991 and 2002, which we've been sending people around the world. And this was something that was supposed to have been passed in order to go after the people who came after us on 9/11, supposedly go after the so-called weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and there was never anything done. Yet it has been perverted by administrations from both sides of the aisle to justify actions in places like Africa even. And so what I think we've learned is if you're going to go to war, then you know specifically why you're going into that war, what the reason is, and what is the ending. What are the parameters and what is the end? We never defined what the end was to Iraq. So we had this mission creep that went from fighting this war to try to find weapons of mass destruction to then saddling the Department of Defense with nation building, which is not what the military is supposed to do. And so we were there for 20 years.
All right, we're going to turn now to audience questions. I'm going to alternate between here in the room and CCGA Live, so please.
Yes, the United States is not in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Japan's leadership kept it alive. China now wants to try to enter. Whether they can or not is a good question. There's an alternative from the Biden administration that doesn't have the trade components. And that makes it less desirable. Do we need to think about the TPP again?
Well, the reality of the TPP is under today's domestic political situation, it will never happen because it has now become, unfortunately, tied up into this very partisan divide that's happened. So I don't think that we would get a bipartisan group of majority of folks to vote for TPP either in the House or in the Senate. So that's unfortunate. You're right. China could eventually get into the TPP and maximize and exploit a system that was set up by the United States. IPEF, which is what the Biden administration is proposing, is actually doing surprisingly well. The ASEAN has signed on to it, and many of the ASEAN nations have signed on to it, and it is actually proliferating. The idea behind IPEF is not necessarily to set up free trade areas, but to instead lower barriers that would allow market access in a way that, for things like recognizing that another nation's food inspection regime is sufficient for entry into the United States without additional, restrictions, that type of thing. So IPEF is working, and more nations are signing on. So much so that the PRC is getting very nervous, and they have made comments about how, why do people need to join IPEF, because they're opposed to it. But you're right, we should be in a trade agreement of some sort. If we could just maybe rename TPP like we did with, or like we did with USMCS, maybe we get both sides to vote on it. Unfortunately, TPP itself and the name itself has just gotten so caught up in the unfortunate partisan politics that it would never pass the way it is, and even though it would make sense to rejoin it.
Right, a question from our live audience.
Senator Baldwin, thank you very much for your very informative and thoughtful presentation. It was inspiring. From my understanding, you're really talking about an emphasis on decoupling from China. Okay, for many American companies and other companies, and you're seeing nearshoring and friendshoring as a way of decoupling. Now, one of my questions is, how is the cost optimization issue working in Asia with Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand, for example, when companies decouple from China to these countries? Is it costing them more when they do the decoupling, if you understand my question? And the second part of it is, nearshoring has been an issue we've been seeing go on, nearshoring to Mexico. Okay, and you're seeing nearshoring from companies producing cars and manufactured equipment to Mexico, moving away from China. Is this a more cost-beneficial way of producing these items? Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Well, first off, I'm Tammy Duckworth. Tammy Baldwin is the senator from Wisconsin. It's okay. We're part of the Tammy Caucus, and she was voted on unanimously to be chairwoman of the Tammy Caucus. So I adore Tammy Baldwin. I am not saying decouple from China, and let me make that clear. I don't think we should decouple from China. I think we should engage with China, especially economically, but with very clear enforcement of international laws and norms and rules, and I think we do need to impose some new requirements, that deal with intellectual property, for example. I think that is important. I don't think it's viable or even wise to decouple economically from the PRC. As far as moving some of these manufacturing or some of these business concerns into parts of Southeast Asia, that is already happening organically because of the cost of labor in the PRC is increasing. And in fact, many places are moving to Southeast Asia or the mainland parts of Southeast Asia because it actually is more cost effective. So in fact, this is already happening, and I think that is a good trend.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one of the questions from our virtual audience. Does the new Cold War paradigm make sense to you? That is the PRC in any way essentially similar to the former Soviet Union in its relationship with the United States?
I don't think it's similar. I think it's going to be a different relationship. They see themselves and want to be seen and treated as a global superpower. And we just have to make sure that the PRC does not feel that the goal of being recognized as a global superpower is threatened by what the United States is trying to do. What we're trying to do is make sure that we establish international norms and adherence to international law and order, and that we protect American interests, period. And I do think the relationship is different. And one of the ones I talked to you about is that the fact that, they won't even answer the phone when we call militarily. And that is dangerous if you're going to have a Cold War. I'd rather not have a Cold War. But that's dangerous when the other side won't answer the phone.
Hi, Senator. How you doing?
I'm good. Good to see you. How are you?
Not too bad. You have to give me 5 minutes before you leave here today.
Okay, I will.
A couple of things to maybe move the conversation back to stateside. When you stop to think about the things that you're trying to do, can you help me understand, 4 years of the prior administration, how that's kind of run the programs that you're thinking about in the wrong direction? And how is it working with House colleagues that are having more of an isolationist bent than they've ever had before when you add that to their inability to tell the truth?
Thank you. Maybe slightly on the partisan side. But no, listen. Well, I think I just want to talk trade. Trump's trade wars really hurt Illinois and really hurt our ag sector. And that was not helpful whatsoever. I think that, they did some things right. They were able to get USMCS passed, and I actually voted for it. But the outright trade wars that he entered into was not helpful to this country or our economy. And so we are trying to turn that ship around. And I do think that we have to make a lot more investments in that effort. I do think that, again, looking forward, the green technology future is an industry that we here in Illinois can really grow to dominate and own and turn around to sell that technology to the rest of the world. And I think that's a place where we can make some investments, but it's also going to be getting back into, these trade agreements, sort of going back a little bit. I mean, he put us out of TPP. He put us out of the Iran nuclear deal. That's not an economic issue, but that really hurt us. And now national security, both in terms of military security and also economic.
Another question from our virtual audience. U.S. companies are struggling to understand what business they should do with the PRC because U.S. policy isn't clear. Mm-hmm. So some companies may be decoupling out of fear. That may further deteriorate U.S.-China relations. What do you recommend to companies that are nervous about national security issues and sanctions, et cetera?
Yeah, I think the key thing is to think about intellectual property and anything that has to do with cybersecurity and the like. And I mean, something as simple as what we think of as a toy now, as these drones, can certainly become an issue, right? There are a lot of Chinese-made drones that are used to film weddings and, walks in the park or whatever. Well, they're being used in Ukraine to help spot Russian troop formations. But the Russians turned around, made a deal with the Chinese to have them release the codes for those drones that they made in the PRC so that they could actually track where the Ukrainians were and kill them. And so there's some, so that's an example of what seems innocuous, which is a toy, now suddenly has a military use to it. I think that companies that are nervous should engage actively, proactively with the Department of Commerce, with their trade associations, and talk about where those lines are. I don't think that we have to worry about national security when it comes to intellectual property in terms of agriculture. But I certainly do think that if you deal in anything that has to do with telecommunications technology, microchips and the like, then that is an issue. That is an area that is very much being focused on in national security circles.
Hello, Senator. Thank you for being here. You spoke earlier about not only maintaining but increasing our presence in the Pacific, and I'm assuming that's inclusive of a military presence. And I believe it was just this last week, 60 Minutes on their A block had a lot about the difficulties that the U.S. Navy has had maintaining the number of ships in its fleet, and also keeping those ships out in the field. I believe they said that in the 80s, there was 30 shipyards domestically that maintained our fleet, and now there's 7. What do you see as being the top challenges in increasing our military presence, our naval presence in the Pacific, if that's something that we need to do, or is there enough in the budget right now for the surface fleet? And what else do we need, or do we need to do more of a better job just keeping the ships that we, this current ship count better maintained?
So I think it's logistics. The logistical supply, literal supply chain into the Pacific region is critically important and definitely in need of significant investments when it comes to maintaining the fleet readiness of our ships and submarines. We are challenged right now with building and maintaining our submarine force. And in fact, under the AUKUS agreement, Australia is going to be building submarines as well. And so we're going to need to refurbish and build our submarines and help them build their new ones. And that's going to be a real challenge because we only have a certain number of shipyards that could do that. So certainly we need to make those investments. But when I talk about increasing our presence in the Indo-Pacific, especially with military forces, I don't necessarily mean more ships all the time. I think that there are other things that can be done. For example, we just provided 2 Coast Guard cutters to Vietnam. And that was something that Vietnam was able to receive because it's a Coast Guard ship, not a military ship. It's used for policing functions and for maintaining your coastlines and inland waterways and that sort of thing. So they were able to accept that and be able to tell the PRC, hey, this was not a military, this is doing a policing function, which is helpful because in fact the PRC is conducting incursions into Vietnamese waters to ship and exploit, So those are the kinds of things that we can do. I've been championing the Army Corps of Engineers to be present in many more ways around Southeast Asia, especially when you do things like flood mitigation. I had lots of conversations with many of the representatives in the defense departments for other countries. And I talk a lot about, hey, Illinois is a big Mississippi state. It's a big river state, and we deal with flooding all the time. You deal with flooding on the Mekong River. How about we have the CBs, the Army Corps of Engineers, come in and help you deal with the flooding on the river and erosion issues. And Indonesia, it's no longer the capital city, Jakarta, because they just created a new one, is sinking. Well, that is something the Army Corps of Engineers can certainly be a presence on. So there are ways for us to be in the region, to be there as a presence, to have a permanent foothold without necessarily it always being aircraft carriers.
All right, I'm going to combine 2 questions that are very similar that we've received from online. U.S. politicians always say that they are not opposed to the people of China, but when the only discussion of China treats the country as a monolithic threat, it slips very easily into generalized suspicion of anyone Chinese. How can U.S. politicians humanize the people of China and emphasize the many commonalities between the people of the 2 countries? And then another question that we got is, how do we compete with the PRC without stoking anti-Asian racism at home?
Yeah. Well, you've noticed that I've not said the word China at all. I've said PRC this entire time. I differentiate between the government of the nation and that is why I say PRC, because it is too easy to conflate and to mix Chinese people with the government of the People's Republic of China. And you have seen increased hate and violence against AANHPIers in this country, and in particular East Asians, because people think that they're all Chinese during the pandemic. And a big part of that is the former president talking about the Wuhan virus and blaming the Chinese people. And that led to significant increases in violence against Asian Americans in this country. And so we have to stop that. I see that as my role in the Senate, where I can help lead and have that conversation with my colleagues and change the dialogue in this country to talk about there is a difference between the PRC government and Chinese people. While there's a very strong sense of nationalism and patriotism in the PRC from its citizens are also some of the most oppressed people in the world, and they are themselves victimized by their own government. And so we need to continue to be that beacon of democracy. We need to support free speech. We need to support human rights. And that means also at times, standing up and supporting the rights of the people who live under the PRC government to have access to freedom of speech. And and setting what those standards are. But that is why I consistently say PRC.
Hi, Senator. Thank you
Hi.
for being here. So I am a high school history teacher and government teacher here in Chicago.
Excellent.
And I talked to my students about getting to see you tonight.
Oh,
They're jealous they can't be here.
you should have me come to your school.
I don't. Well, let's talk. Okay.
Yeah.
But so I told them, like, if they had questions, I would ask one of them. So one of the questions that came up from a few students was, knowing how we've gone from Obama to Trump now to Biden, and who knows what 2024 holds. We've had very different approaches on foreign policy, and you even alluded to the United States under Trump leaving the Iran nuclear agreement, Paris climate agreement. So how can the U.S. effectively engage in the world, in foreign policy, knowing the level of like partisanship in the country and knowing how our parties are having like pretty diametrically opposed positions on issues like addressing climate change and human rights and the future of support for Ukraine and inevitably Taiwan as well?
Well, I think that is where having a country that has three different components to our government, right? You've got the executive branch, you've got the judiciary, and you've got the legislative branch, and consistency among the other branches is important. Now we've seen some major changes there as well. But it's why, as a member of the legislative branch, I try to make all of my engagements overseas very bipartisan. So when I go on these trips, I try to bring Republicans with me, and I've got one coming up through the Shangri-La Dialogue, and Senator Sullivan of Alaska is my partner in that, and we go and we unite and we link arms, and we will have conversations with leadership of other countries and say, we don't agree with each other because we're from different political parties, but we're here together and we're here to talk to you and we're still Americans. And so I think it's really important to send the message to the rest of the world that who is in the White House is not who runs the government of this country. That is just one of the three branches of government. And sometimes it's hard for people to understand that because, especially if you're in a country or a tradition that's very autocratic, the person who's in charge is the person who runs the country. And by continuing to exercise our democracy, small d democracy, and making sure that our judiciary works and all of those things, we send that message of the consistency of American democracy. Yes, we had an insurrection in the United States Capitol, yet we still held an election, and we still got a new president, and we had another election after that, and it's still working. It's messy, but it's still working, and I think that's the most important message to send.
All right, we're almost out of time, so we're going to take one more question from here in the room.
Thank you, Senator. Since 1962, the PRC and the Indian government had conflicted over the Himalayan mountain range, which are the origins of some of the most important river systems in the world. Large rivers such as the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Irrawaddy, the Salween, the Mekong, the Yangtze, and Yellow River all originate from the Himalayas. Up to 40% of the world's population depends on the fresh water and food produced from these major river systems. China is attempting to control this region of eastern Ladakh and other sections of the border through violence and forceful means and high-tech weapons without actually firing any weapons like guns. They are also building dams and weaponizing hydropower, which will hold downstream nations hostage. Is the United States willing to help the downstream nations or India to control this threat? Thank you.
You're welcome. The answer is yes, of course we are, but we can't do it alone. And these nations have to partner with us as well. And a nation like India has played both sides of that, right? They're in conflict with the PRC, but then they also have stood with the PRC on many issues. And so we need to be sure we're willing to work and we're willing to safeguard those resources, but we can't do it alone. And in fact, it would not be legitimate for us to do it alone. We have to have the partners in local other nations, and many times they have to take the lead, and we have to be their partners, but we can't be the lead, because then it would be seen as American imperialism coming in, and that's not what we want either.
Well, we are just about out of time, so I would just like to ask you as one final question of what would you recommend to your constituents and to other Americans across the country to keep an eye out for and watch for in our relationship with countries in the Indo-Pacific?
I think the economic opportunities and to try to promote those, and if you're a business owner, to really think about the opportunities that are there. And I'm doing everything that I can to try to grow those trade relationships with Indo-Pacific. And it's really quite remarkable and how fertile this is. I was talking to Mitsubishi, and Mitsubishi is in Logistech. They make forklifts and warehouse moving equipment and all of that. And they're in partnerships with Caterpillar, an Illinois company, and they're looking to switch their engines for those small machines to ethanol, which then we could provide from Illinois. So there's a lot of opportunities there. And that's what I would tell my constituents is look at the opportunities that are there and take advantage of them, because I'm going to make sure Illinois becomes the leader in the country when it comes to green technology. And a big chunk of that is going to be partnering with Asian companies.
Well, thank you so much. We are just honored to have you here today. Grateful for your time.
My
If you'll all please join me in thanking the Senator.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.